Final Fantasy XVI was developed and published by Square Enix. The game stands as the newest mainline entry in the long-running Final Fantasy series, which spans a multi-decade history. And this is the second mainline game in the franchise that acts as an ARPG, with a real-time combat system. This continues the tradition set by Final Fantasy XV before it. Now, this game makes a bold claim that it's an ARPG, but the term RPG should and will be used very loosely here. This isn't truly an RPG game. The RPG elements are lacking. What Final Fantasy XVI truly is stands as an action game meant to reel in a younger, new generation of fans, as producer Naoki Yoshida has mentioned in interviews prior to release. However, in doing this, Square Enix has made a critical mistake, which isn't really a mistake considering they've been doing this for multiple games now, several years in a row. Square Enix in this game specifically commits the sin of alienating the original fanbase. When I say original, I mean the people who actually made this franchise a mainstream success. After you take into account everything that this game does, everything it has to offer, everything that makes up the bulk of what Final Fantasy XVI is, both on a narrative and gameplay level, any common sense would lead you to the facts. And the fact, in this case, with this game, is that it's a solid action game that has effective moments of high-speed bravado that boost adrenaline with blood-pumping fights that are both cinematic and engaging, but everything has a cost. In Square Enix's attempt to pull in as wide a casual audience as humanly possible, they've purposely neglected the most important elements that make Final Fantasy what it is, and as a result, they've created one of the worst games in the entire franchise.
And then it's like you have these open fields, but there's nothing to do. There's nothing to do in it. It's just a bunch of wide open space.
Upon taking into consideration the issues that this game has, it quickly becomes robustly evident that this game is aimed at the lowest common denominator imaginable. And this is not surprising whatsoever. I've stated time and time again that Square Enix and Final Fantasy in general has one of the dumbest fan bases in the medium of video games, with some of the most ignorant and cringe-worthy fans to ever disgrace the RPG landscape. But this bullshit goes deeper than that. This time, I can't even blame the fans, really, because this game wasn't designed for the fans, unlike past entries. To put things into perspective, the Final Fantasy series, and by extension, Square Enix, started to deviate away from the series tradition of the strategic turn-based genre, starting with Final Fantasy XII, which by all accounts is one of the franchise's best entries. Slowly, with each subsequent game, they've been moving towards a real-time combat system, having created multiple hybrid combat systems that were never revisited, including the MMO-style system with Final Fantasy XII, the Paradigm system with Final Fantasy XIII, and the real-time hybrid system with Final Fantasy VII Remake. With regards to what system struck a chord with general audiences and is the best medium between both worlds of turn-based and real-time, the combat system in Final Fantasy VII Remake is the best amalgamation of both styles. The game successfully brought a faster one-to-one combat system as the core attraction, all the while retaining the strategic thought process that came with the turn-based games of old. Now, it wasn't perfect. It's a system that contained a multitude of problems, which includes damage sponge enemies via the stagger system, a terrible evade system that for the most part doesn't work, enemy AI that focuses on the player almost entirely ignoring the other party members, forcing the player to switch characters constantly, a lack of a jump button, a lack of invincibility frames after selecting certain actions, etc. But it's a system that did work as intended, and it very much had the Final Fantasy spirit with character switching, use of spells, buffs and debuffs, and the element of strategy was very much present. The problem with Final Fantasy XVI's combat is that strategy has been completely removed from the experience. This game is about one thing and one thing only when it comes to the combat system: dealing as much damage as possible, as fast as possible. Strategy is not at the forefront or even at the back end of the experience. It's just simply not there at all whatsoever. What you get in the first 2 hours of the game is really what you get throughout the rest of the experience. The core of the combat system doesn't truly change from start to finish. It takes too long for the combat system to open up, and even when you do get the full range of options with the different summons that are available, the system still severely limits what you can do thanks to some very poor design choices. They got the combat designer from Devil May Cry to come in and do this combat system, but it shows that he didn't put in his best effort here. The way I critique games and entertainment in general is simple. I look at what a game is and ask the question of, how could this have been done better? I don't play a game and critique it saying that this should have been this, unless the game is just that terrible to the point where that's a valid take. When I play a game, I look at what the developers tried to do and determine what works and what didn't work. When I determine and see what the weaknesses are, I then offer solutions as to what could have been done to make what the developers tried to do better. That's the proper way to be objective, but in order to be objective about a topic, you need to have experience with that topic. I've played the Devil May Cry games, all of them. I've completed every game in the series from Devil May Cry 3 all the way through 5, including the reboot on the hardest difficulty setting. This game with its combat system is a Devil May Cry clone done worse than Devil May Cry does Devil May Cry. The main fault here is that the options that the game gives you is limited to the extreme. Using the latest entry in that series, Devil May Cry 5, as an example, Clive most relates to Nero, but he also has some options that Dante possesses as well. If you take Nero specifically fully upgraded with access to his full range of moves, he eclipses Final Fantasy XVI's Clive completely. Clive is missing several critical options that prevent the combat from feeling repetitive and limited. These options include a double jump, with one of the only ways to gain any sort of momentum and height in the air is to utilize the enemy's step ability combined with Garuda's Wicked Wheel. Even then, he only has a 3-hit base combo in the air, which means that he must use some sort of ability in the air to get in an air combo. The problem here is that nearly every icon ability in the game can only be used on the ground. There's less than a handful of abilities that can be used while airborne. Clive doesn't have Nero's 4-hit air combo or even the full range of airborne abilities that's possible in Devil May Cry 5's combat system. He has the same problem on the ground with only a 4-hit basic combo possible, with only one alternate combo string with the magic burst alternating between 2 face buttons. Nero, by comparison, has 4 different ground combos that can be combined and alternated with his Devilbringer arm, whose capabilities were greatly expanded with Devil May Cry 5 compared to DMC4. What this does is limit what the player can do exclusively to the icon abilities, and that's the entire point of this combat system with Final Fantasy XVI. The combat system revolves exclusively around the icon abilities, but even that's not satisfying. Not only are the full range of options limited, emphasis on that word again, limited, because there's only 5 available moves per icon by the time you gain access to all of them by the end game, but you can only equip 2 moves per icon and 3 icons at a time. What's worse is that the abilities are locked to each icon, so if you want to use an ability that Odin has, you must equip Odin unless you spend a ridiculous amount of AP to master a specific skill so that skill can be equipped to any icon you choose. This terrible design choice reminded me of the bullshit that Slowclap pulled with Sifu. This is a garbage and lazy way to force the player to spend more time playing the game in some sad attempt to artificially extend the runtime. But wait! Many would argue that despite all this, the combat system is still enjoyable because it retains the mechanical depth of Devil May Cry. And to this point, I concur. Up to a certain point. Yes, you can pull off some crazy, flashy combos reminiscent of the Devil May Cry series. Yes, you can experiment with the system, mix and match various skills in order to achieve something that looks stylish. The problem, however, is that you can do all these things to a fault. The combat system is still limited because of restrictions in how many summons and abilities you can equip. It's limited even further due to the cooldown system. Whenever you use an icon ability, that ability goes into a cooldown to where you can't use it until it becomes available again. The cooldown times differ from skill to skill. There are items that you can equip, accessories that will decrease cooldown times, but they're skill specific, and you can only equip up to 3 different accessories at a time for the entire game. That goes into a different problem that I will address later. The biggest problem with this combat system is that even if you do find a lengthy, stylish combo you want to use, let's say you've done what I did and took the time to experiment a bit with the different abilities in the game, and you come up with a sick-ass combo you want to use in the main game that you took the time to practice in the training mode, guess what? It's unlikely you'll be able to use that sick-ass combo you took the time to build in the full game because the enemies aren't strong enough to withstand all of that damage. I came up with this combo using abilities from Garuda, Shiva, and Bahamut, which I will display now. The problem with something like this is that it's not viable in the full game. I can only use portions of it in the game, and because of that, it's best to equip other abilities to maximize damage, which is why I removed both of Shiva's abilities, and replaced them with something different. The enemies are too weak to take advantage of the full capabilities of the system. Even on the higher difficulty setting, Final Fantasy mode, the enemies are still too weak, and if there's enough enemies on screen, it's very easy for something like this to be interrupted, or for the player to make a mistake, even if it's not their fault, and the combo just doesn't work. It's simply not viable. That doesn't even get to the core issue with this combat system, which is this. The game is too fucking easy. There is no challenge here. When Square Enix announced that they got the combat designer for Devil May Cry to work on this, I knew immediately that it was going to have problems. Devil May Cry is a great franchise, but it doesn't work for a Final Fantasy game, nor should it. Devil May Cry isn't an RPG series, it's a hack and slash series. We're talking about 2 entirely different genres here. The reason Devil May Cry works is not the same reason why Final Fantasy works. Devil May Cry has been criticized by people who don't like it because the enemies just stand around, and there's not much challenge unless you're playing it on the harder difficulty settings. And those critics would be right. Except, the difficulty isn't what Devil May Cry is about, like the Souls games. Devil May Cry is all about being as stylish as possible, which is why there's a grading system on screen to let you know how you're doing in your performance. When you reach the end of a stage, the game gives you a final grade, with D being the lowest and S being the highest. That's why you must be stylish to pull off those long extended combos, because playing that way will raise your grade and give you a better score at the end of any given stage. And it's been this way since the beginning of that series for over 20 years. Final Fantasy XVI's combat system doesn't work because it doesn't have that grading system. There's not even a fucking hit counter like you had in games like Batman Arkham, the PlayStation Spider-Man games, or even in this game's predecessor with Final Fantasy XV. Well, wait a minute, what about the arcade mode? That grades you, doesn't it? Yes, it does. And there's 2 different arcade modes, the second being more difficult than the first. I've played one level in arcade mode to see what it's about. The game does grade you for your performance, but once you equip certain skills, you can simply just spam the icon abilities as they become available to you, and you'll achieve a super high score with minimal effort. Not to mention, this is supplemental content that's optional, so it doesn't really count in general. Devil May Cry's grading system is present 24/7 because that's the point of the fucking game. Final Fantasy gameplay-wise is supposed to be about strategy. The combat in these games is supposed to be something where you have to think. You have to mix and match various skills with a full party of characters in order to achieve success. That's the reason turn-based games are fun, because they offer something called mental engagement, which is a different type of fun factor. Action games like Devil May Cry are fun too, but the engagement is almost purely reactionary. Final Fantasy VII Remake was a reactionary game regarding the fun factor, but the mental engagement was still there. I'll give a perfect example of a challenge from that game that you will find nothing similar to it here with Final Fantasy XVI. The Weiss boss fight from the Intergrade DLC is the hardest boss fight in Final Fantasy VII Remake to the point of it being borderline cheap. But that fight does what Final Fantasy does best. It forces you, the player, to think about what you're doing all the while managing a full party of characters, which is why I'm going to show myself playing this boss without commentary to emphasize my point.
I'd keep my distance if I were you. Get him! I want a hard shot! Go on! That's it! You asked for it. This fight's not over yet. Take the lead. I'm coming. Can you take over for a bit? All set. I'm not going out like this. I can't.
Let's do this. Keep it together.
Come on. Let me handle this. Damn it. Sure, however I can help. Sorry, but you handle it. We gotta switch it up. I should probably
Take it over.
Good to know. Either way, see you in deep ground.
Took you long enough.
Not only is there just one playable character in Final Fantasy XVI, not only are your party members completely useless, including the one permanent party member in the game, this fucking dog that acts only as a weak combo extender with zero other purpose for being present on screen, but the only fight in the entirety of Final Fantasy XVI that forces you to truly think about what you're doing is the one against Barnabas, and that's only because of how his attack animations have been designed. Every other challenge in the game only asks the player to dodge at the appropriate time and attack animation is launched, and that comes down to only mastering timing. Once you've done that, the rest of the game is a joke. There is no strategy necessary because there's no grading system, and the game is too easy a challenge. There's no party to manage. Your options are severely limited without a deck-based system that would allow to switch between different icon sets on the fly, and you have no access whatsoever to traditional Final Fantasy skills, including Cure, Protect, Haste, or others that for whatever random reason the enemy AI can use those skills, but not you yourself. The combat system is ultimately irrelevant as a result, and that gets me to the second major issue with this game, which is with regards to its content. Final Fantasy XVI, outside its weak casualized combat system, has no meaningful content, and no, that's not hyperbole, that's fact.
You hardly get any experience from doing these side quests. You just get a bunch of crafting materials, and the crafting system is useless. There's no point in crafting anything in this game. It's too easy.
When in between story missions, the game simply has fuck all for the player to do. Say what you will about open world games with a spatter of random collectibles and useless trinkets to collect, at least those games give the player a reason to keep playing. Final Fantasy XVI has nothing of value with the exception of side quests, except those suck shit too. These side quests are the most boring ass fucking missions imaginable. Some of them are interesting from a narrative standpoint, and we're talking a select few by the way, but all of them are garbage from a gameplay perspective, and that's unforgivable. Hey Clive, go here and deliver some bowls of food.
For your trouble, I can offer you the contents of my strongbox and my enduring gratitude.
I don't see why not.
My thanks. I hope you do not think me lazy for waiting to be served like a lord. Only my former master did not use me kindly, you see. He left me half lame, truth be told. That seed took me in nonetheless. The hideaway is the home I never knew, and a mighty fine one at that. Your food. I was hoping it might be. Well, doesn't this look fine? Thank you, lad. You're new, aren't you? Jealous running your rabbit already, I expect, you old rascal. Well, he did say he'd give me something for my trouble. And so he should. We're not slaves anymore. Well met, lad. And keep up the good work. Well, so much more to farming than just seeds and soil. Your food. Just a moment. I need to finish this. I won't be a burden. I'm of no use to anyone as I am, but maybe if I can master this. All right, then. See that you eat it before it gets cold. Of course. Thank you. That's the last one, then. I better let Kenneth know. All done, I presume? Splendid. They were bearers. All three of them. Not slaves waiting upon their master's pleasure, but men waiting to be fed like equals. Indeed, equality is the very cornerstone upon which our little community is founded. Beyond these walls, we are scorned as slaves, speaking only when spoken to, eating only what scraps our masters deign to give us. The first hot meal here is the first menu we'll have known. In the hideaway, we are free, truly free to speak as we please, when we please, and to eat what and when we desire. More than reason enough to trust in Sid's vision, wouldn't you say? Now, I promised you something for your trouble, did I not? The contents of my strongbox are yours to do with as you will. Thank you, Clive. Do come and visit me again, won't you?
Hey, Clive, go here and kill this thing because I told you to.
Well, that beats tacking boards to bridges, sure enough. And if Martha didn't mind me being gone a while, then neither do I. You just tell me where you want me.
That's the spirit.
I couldn't ask a favor, though, could I? Before we go?
Of course.
Well, that there is Cressida, where I grew up. Ain't much left of it now, though. Except my parents' graves. But I came up here hoping to visit. I even patched up the bridge to get across. Only to find the place crawling with fiends. But you're a dab hand when it comes to dealing with beasts and bogles, ain't you? Any chance you could,
It's the least I can do.
Well, thank you kindly. And take care.
This shouldn't take long.
Hey, Clive, you bitch. Go here and deliver this. Collect this. Kill this.
Tell me of these Morgan beards, then.
But of course.
Was hoping to speak to you. Is everything alright? Oh, yeah, it's just, well, as you know, we've been trying to grow fruit down here. It's good to know that something of the old hideaway still lives on. Martel's pride and joy. It was a sacrament she rescued it from the rubble, but look at it now. All our hard work's finally paying off. I took it on, you see, after she died, and now the fruit's finally ready to eat. And not only is it ready, it's actually tasty. Sweet as you like, in fact. She bred the bitter right out of it. Impressive. And welcome news to more than a few, I'd say. I thought this first harvest could go to the curse breakers on account of all
And your reward for doing this? Useless. A bunch of crafting items that you don't need and won't use. Final Fantasy VII Remake already had a serious issue with its side quests, but this game takes the mediocrity to the next level. I've never been so fucking bored in a video game doing side quests compared to the fuckery that exists in Final Fantasy XVI. Square Enix didn't even try. The side quests were simply implemented to check a box so the game can pretend to be something it's really bad at being, which is an RPG. There's no point to really any of the side quests as the rewards for completing them is weak beyond comprehension. It's a fucking travesty of outdated game design similar to the fucking garbage ass random QTEs from 2005 in the boss fights. To make things even more unbearable, the random items you come across mainly exist in the form of gil. And when I say gil, I'm talking 2 or 10 gil. There's no interesting item pickups, which renders exploration pointless. The game is just fucking boring, regardless whether you're exploring a hallway corridor or you're venturing through a vast open field, and the open fields are worse than the fucking hallway corridors. This is Final Fantasy XIII all over again, and sometimes done worse than that game's pathetic attempt at exploration. The game would be more bearable with a sprint button to make it less painful. Oh, and there's a sprint that exists in the game, but it's the Devil May Cry sprint ripped from those games, unwisely inserted randomly in this game. The sprint activates on its own accord, without your input, and it only works after you've ran in place for a few seconds. It doesn't work in towns where it's needed the most, so the majority of the time you're exploring, using that term very loosely, Clive is simply doing this military-style jog like he has no fucking care in the world. Playing this game gave me flashbacks of my time at Paris Island when I was a recruit for the Marine Corps. I don't want to be reminded about my time at Paris Island when I was a recruit for the Marine Corps. It was not a fun experience. What would have made this game worthwhile when it comes to exploration would have been to implement smaller tasks in the various maps that aren't boring-ass side quests. They could have even implemented specific locations as collectible items that would have drawn interest in the world itself, which is what games like Spider-Man and Hogwarts Legacy did to an effective degree. They could have at least put in some optional dungeons, like, come on! This game is apparently an RPG, right? How come the only dungeons are the ones from the story missions, as in, they don't count? Get the fuck out of here with this trash. This is the definition of lazy. Then you have the fucking so-called customization system, where you can only equip 3 accessories at a time, which varies from damage increase items for specific skills, general attack increase items, ability cooldown reduction items, and the timely rings or whatever the fuck they're called that takes what's already a casual game and performs a babality on it for senior citizens and disabled people and inept, incompetent morons who can't perform the way the game wants them to perform. So, fuck it. Let's make the same mistake that we made with Final Fantasy XIII and Final Fantasy XV. Let's give the player the option to have the gameplay itself. And that's handled even worse here, considering the pitfalls with the story and the fact that there's barely anything to play here at all, to where this can even be considered a video game. But before I get to the ridiculous story, I do want to mention that it's sad that the modern God of War games, which are RPG games, are more RPG than a modern mainline Final Fantasy entry. The God of War games, both God of War 2018 and God of War Ragnarok, have more customization than what you find in Final Fantasy XVI. Games like the Horizon series and even Final Fantasy XV has more customization in them than Final Fantasy XVI. Horizon and Final Fantasy XV are legit RPGs with multiple weapon classes, with basic buffs and debuffs, numerous status effects, with an array of unlockable character skins. Final Fantasy XVI doesn't even have more than one weapon class. Clive is stuck with the fucking sword throughout the entire game. What even is this garbage? This is trash. RPG, my ass. So, the gameplay in this game is shallow despite its mechanical depth. The customization system is lacking to the point of laziness. The RPG systems are practically non-existent and pale in comparison to other games that do it far better. The content is boring and repetitive to the extreme, but I did say with my review of the demo that the story may be this game's saving grace. Well, it was. For a few hours until it completely collapses within on itself. This game was marketed to be a revenge story. Square Enix stated that this was the case with the earliest debut trailer that this game was going to be a revenge tale. The first 2 hours of the game that they released as the playable demo fucking sets up the game to be a revenge story, and does so rather exceptionally well. Even the fucking email I received on release day from Square Enix clearly states, and I quote, "The moment has come for you to experience Clive's life-changing quest for revenge." End quote. The fucking cover art suggests that this is a gritty revenge plot. However, this game is anything but that. What I was saying before this game was released was that I wasn't confident that Square Enix could pull off this revenge tale, but I was intrigued by the setup at the beginning of the game, which is really the only reason I bought it in the first place and decided to cover it. Turns out, Square Enix didn't even try to pull off a revenge tale because that's not what the game is actually about. At the beginning of the game, Joshua, Clive's younger brother, is seemingly killed by himself, and he spends the next 13 years plotting his revenge against some random dude in a hood to avenge his brother's death until he realizes that he killed Joshua himself. This is an intriguing revelation because it hinges on the character's guilt, which could lead him down a darker path. Nevertheless, this is a 50-plus hour game when you include the boring side quests. Within the first 10 fucking hours of the game, Joshua is revealed to be alive and well. Now, perhaps Joshua blames Clive for what happened at Phoenix Gate, and he wants revenge himself. This kind of setup has potential because it could pit brother against brother, creating for the best sibling rivalry in gaming since, ironically, Dante and Virgil. But do we get that? Nope. Instead, we get something so ridiculously stupid that it destroys the goodwill of the game's opening hours. As it turns out, Joshua follows Clive for a bit throughout the game because he's trying to protect him from a deity, some godlike being called Ultima. But who or what is Ultima? Ultima is an alien. I'm not fucking joking. It's not a joke. That's what Ultima is. Ultima is from a race of sentient beings who created the world and humanity in order to rid themselves of a scourge known as the Blight. They created the mother crystals that Clive is trying to destroy because the mother crystals release something called aether, which is this substance that allows for the manipulation of magic. Too much aether creates the blight that eats away the environment and kills everything in it, which is why Clive wants to rid the world of the mother crystals. The human hosts to the summons, referred to as dominants, and the summons themselves, referred to as icons, are capable of using aether without much risk in turning Akashic, or turning into a rage-fueled husk. Clive is what's known as Mythos, someone who can channel a massive amount of aether and use all of the icons. When Clive destroys one of the mother crystals, he unknowingly releases Ultima, who then manipulates Clive to do battle with the other dominants, so that he can absorb their powers and use their icon. Once Clive has all of the icons, he essentially becomes the perfect vessel, a new body for Ultima. With Clive's body, Ultima can erase the Blight and restart the world for his race, but with the intention on leaving humanity behind to die, as humanity's purpose was meant only to save Ultima and his people. However, humanity, through Clive and others, gained a will of their own during Ultima's slumber, and Clive's fierce will and determination makes him strong enough to kill Ultima, freeing humanity once and for all. The problem with this story is that it's filled with cliché anime tropes. It's a world-ending event, which is a problem within of itself because the stakes are raised to ridiculous levels when the game started with a much more simple and realistic take on what a Final Fantasy game can be. And ultimately, it's been done before and done better before with other JRPGs, such as Persona 5, and including past Final Fantasy games, specifically with Final Fantasy VI and Final Fantasy VII, which destroy this game from a storytelling perspective, all the while using the same world-ending trope as its primary challenge to the cast. One of the reasons this game's story fails is because Ultima is not an interesting villain. He's an impervious godlike being who operates from the shadows. We don't even learn who or what Ultima is until the very end of the game. By the time we do learn who he is, the story is already bad at that point. Learning of Ultima's origin just makes things worse. It's not interesting, it's just bad storytelling. Final Fantasy VI, VII, and others have proper setups for antagonist characters like Kefka and Sephiroth, which is why those characters are popular. In this game's case, Ultima is no better a character than Arden was in Final Fantasy XV. It goes back to that good old adage, a story is only as good as its villain. This is true for any medium of entertainment when it comes to storytelling, but the problem goes deeper than Ultima. This game had a fucking brilliant villain already with Clive's mother, Annabella. The character, despite her sparse appearances, has a great introduction, and her presence is felt throughout the game, even when she's not on screen. She orders soldiers from the Empire to hunt down and kill bearers who are essentially slaves without any regard for life. What better a villain could this game have had for its main character but his own mother? You can't have a better villain than that because a mother's love should be unlimited and unconditional. Annabella clearly hates Clive because he didn't awaken as the dominant of Phoenix. His little brother Joshua did. It's not revealed until later that Clive is actually a dominant himself. Annabella could have learned this but still rejected Clive because she spent so many years hating him anyway. Once a bitch, always a bitch. Instead, what happens when Clive reunites with his mother? You get some strange scene where she rants at him. He doesn't try to reconcile with her. Nothing really happens between them. He even turns into Ifrit in front of her, and the game doesn't even show her reaction. When she sees that Joshua is alive, she goes crazy and kills herself. It's the most anticlimactic death I've ever seen in a video game. What the fuck were they thinking? The game literally sets up some anime bullshit that forces a sci-fi twist in a game that has a medieval setting. Make it make sense. Annabella isn't the only wasted opportunity in the game. The Game of Thrones influence is wasted here as well. The influence from Game of Thrones is surface level. The game doesn't do anything interesting with it. It's purely there for aesthetics. The characters drop F-bombs a lot, and there's some blood here and there, but it goes no further than that. This is the most baby M-rated game ever. Square Enix was too afraid to alienate the audience they were targeting, so they omitted the use of words like cunt and whore and cock. Vulgar terms used consistently in Game of Thrones. Gory, controversial deaths like Oberyn Martell, Shireen Baratheon, Joffrey Baratheon, and Ramsay Bolton are non-existent in this game. You have no truly interesting side characters like what you have in Game of Thrones or its prequel series House of the Dragon. There's a serious lack of development and screen time with every single character in this game, including Sid, Jill, and even Joshua. The whole game revolves around Clive and what he's doing, which is the problem. Fuck that. This is supposed to be a Final Fantasy game. Where are the interesting side characters? The Game of Thrones influence, going back to it, you don't even have any real nudity. You see some ass here and there, but there are no nipple slips or genitalia shown. You don't see anything. The camera blocks all nudity. Square Enix used the Game of Thrones influence in a cheap way to falsely manipulate people into buying the game, thinking that they were going to get a more mature Final Fantasy game. Does this look mature to you? then you have an issue that no video game should have. There's more than 11 hours worth of cutscenes in this game. That time is extended by several hours because of the in-game cutscenes from the side quests. Most of the game, you're just watching things happen with very sparse input on the controller. That works for interactive dramas like Heavy Rain, Until Dawn, House of the Ashes, Detroit Become Human, and others. It even works for games like Mass Effect or Fallout because of the dialogue system. Final Fantasy XVI is not an interactive drama. It's not an RPG game with a diverse dialogue system that has permanent choices in critical moments. It's a watered-down Devil May Cry game that's been window-dressed to be something more than what it actually is. Oh, and the icon fights. Some of them are cool, but they're all very limited in their interaction. You only have so many actions that you can take. You can only play as Ifrit, and no, Phoenix doesn't count. These moments are extremely scripted to be as cinematic as possible to the point where player involvement becomes severely restrictive. And these moments highlight two bigger problems. Number one, they've been done before and done better before with games like God of War 3, Azura's Wrath, and the Naruto Storm games. Number two, you can't summon any of the icons in battle. Oh, you can use their abilities, but you can't legit summon Odin or Shiva or Ifrit or any of the summons in the battle, like a traditional Final Fantasy game. This is called Final Fantasy, right? They didn't even get the ending right. There's a 2-minute cutscene that basically renders the entire story irrelevant. Reached the end of this fucking nonsense right here from Square Enix. So, I believe this is the final cutscene. It's post-credit scene, so I'm not looking forward to seeing what they have in store here.
Every time. Will you light it? Yes, Mother. Come on. If only I had the flames of an icon.
Icon? Have you been reading that silly story again? Magic belongs in fairy tales, and fairy tales don't boil kettles. You see? Well done. Now, be a good lad, and play with your brother until supper.
Come on! Hurry! Hurry! All right. Right, let's play the Saint in the Secretary. No, I don't want to be Madu. What do you want to play then?
What?
More of the icons. Again?
These motherfuckers did not just do that.
Right, I'm the older brother.
These bitches did not just do what I think they just did. You just rendered the entire fucking story pointless. The whole thing was bullshit. Nah, this ain't it. This ain't it, Chief. Sorry. This ain't winning no Game of the Year awards. Not in this fucking lifetime. Unbelievable. Final Fantasy XVI is another failed attempt at trying to bring the series to a mainstream audience. It blatantly abandons OG fans for this newer fanbase that never liked the series to begin with, never appreciated it for what it is. The game doesn't remotely resemble anything that a Final Fantasy game should have. It has no strategy with its combat system, with players simply bragging about how flashy the game is, coming up with stupid combos that ultimately mean nothing in context with the game's casual attempt at creating difficulty. It has uninteresting side characters, a boring, underdeveloped main villain, a wasted villain that ultimately becomes unimportant, a stupid ending that makes no sense, an interesting setup that the game abandons very early on. There's no true party system in the game. There's no in-depth customization system like the materia system of Final Fantasy VII, for example, or the brilliant license board of Final Fantasy XII. The icon fights are way too restrictive in how they control, basically boiling down to interactive cutscenes with only one true playable summon in the game, with Ifrit. There's no actual summon system that's been implemented here. You don't get an airship to explore in the game, and exploration is handled poorly anyway. The supplemental content is weak, only offering more reason to continue experimenting with the broken combat system. The list goes on and on and on. It's just terrible. Everything this game does has been done already, and it's been done better before by other games. As an action game with a hack and slash vibe, Devil May Cry, Bayonetta, Metal Gear Rising Revengeance, the older God of War games, and others are better. As an RPG game, the newer God of War games, the Horizon games, the older Final Fantasy games, Persona 5, and others are better. This producer, Naoki Yoshida, is not a good fit for a single-player Final Fantasy experience. Despite all of its bullshit, the Final Fantasy VII Remake is leagues better than this game by fact. It's a proper RPG game, and it's an actual Final Fantasy game complete with multiple playable characters, a real party system. This game is nothing but a bunch of bullshit, and the only way you can enjoy it is if you ignore everything that it gets wrong. Well, as the contrarian that I am, I will once again go against the popular opinion that this is grade A material, and no, I don't believe a weak Devil May Cry clone that's filled with uninspired Game of Thrones fanfiction that's more reminiscent of a Prometheus sequel is something that's worth the word of public opinion. And until Square Enix wakes up and realizes that abandoning your fanbase isn't what's best for business, I'm checking out of this franchise. Even Ubisoft is going back to roots with their most popular flagship series with Assassin's Creed Mirage. If they can do it, so can Square Enix. But this game right here? Fuck it, it's garbage. Could you enjoy Final Fantasy XVI as a casual action game? Sure, but let's not pretend that this is a genuine Final Fantasy experience. Final Fantasy is more than this. Final Fantasy is better than this. And the fans should not only expect more, they should demand more from this company. End of story.
I know that it was you who tore me from my brother. And I know that it is his power that you seek.